Hello there, BTAT 6310. This is a parable project by Alvin Chang. I'll be using the parable known as the forgiving servant, which is Matthew 18:23 to 35. And it goes like this. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. And when he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. And since he could not pay, the master ordered for him to be sold, his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything." And out of pity for him, the master released him and forgave all his debt. And that very same servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. Seizing him, he began to choke him and saying, "Pay what you owe." So the fellow servant fell on his knees and pleaded with him, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you." He refused and went and put him in prison until he should pay all his debt. And when his fellow servants saw what had taken place, they were greatly distressed. And they went and reported to the master all that had taken place. And his master summoned him, the servant, and said to him, "You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. And should not you also have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you?" And in anger, the master of the servant delivered him to the jailer until he should pay all his debt. So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart. Matthew 18:23 to 35. I'll make three observations pretty quickly. Contextual observation, a textual observation, and a theological observation. So we need to see that contextually, this parable was taught in response to Peter's question in verse 21, where it says, "Lord, how often will my brother sin against me?" And then the second part is that if we look at verse 35, we see that it says, "If you do not forgive your brother from your heart." So where does it come from? So it comes from the question that Peter had, but he also refers back to verses 15 to 20, where Jesus taught about forgiving or confronting your brother who sins against you. So understanding that the framework of this parable is in those sections. Okay, so contextually we'll see that. Textually, we see that there are three scenes. The first scene is about God's mercy. We see how God was merciful, so it teaches us about God's mercy. The second scene, it teaches about man's sinful unforgiveness. And then the third scene, it teaches us about God's justice. So those are the three scenes in the text. And then lastly, the theological observation. When we look at each of these scenes, we see that we learn about God's mercy and God's justice. But the underlying theme of this whole parable is actually God's holiness. Holiness usually means being set apart. And usually we think about it in the sense of a separation, God being separated from evil. But God's not just separated from evil, but He's also separated unto good. And so when we read this parable, we understand that God is merciful, and at the same time, God is just. And the interesting thing about this parable is that He is able to be merciful and be just to the same person. And so it's very interesting. However, as it rises to the surface, the application is that since we have been forgiven of so much, we are also ought to forgive other people. And those are my observations. This is Alvin Chang, BTAT 6310.